who will take us through his presentation.
Hello, afternoon, everyone. Amazing to see so many people joining the session. So, welcome. And without further ado, I'll launch into the presentation. So, what I'm talking about today really is the outcome of many years of work over the last 10 years in particular, working in places like Rhynie in Aberdeenshire, but also increasingly further south in what would have been the southern Pictish kingdoms in places like Fife and Perthshire. So what I want to talk to you about today is about the development of society in the late Roman period and into the early medieval centuries. So really describing the period from about 300 AD through to 700 or 800 AD. So really spanning that really important transition in northern Britain when we begin to get the first documented kingdoms and kingship in this part of the world. So I've put up a couple of different pictures here showing two different maps. One on the left is based on Ptolemy's map, the ancient geographer who mapped all the different cultures and groups across the known world at that time. And when describing Scotland, he mentioned or references a whole host of different communities, different groups across the area that we now recognise as Scotland. And this dates to round about the mid 2nd century AD. If we look at on the right hand side, this is a map of the extent of the Pictish kingdoms at its height in the early 8th century, perhaps. So how do we get from these fairly small-scale groups mapped by Ptolemy and described in Roman sources to this really extensive kingdom, which for the time period was very unusual in terms of its geographical extent and reach. So at its height, we think the Pictish kingdoms extended across much of northern, northeast, and western, northwest Scotland. And if you look at recent historical discourse, then the idea recently that's been expounded was that this Pictish identity and the Pictish kingdoms and social complexity was something that was really quite late, really only beginning to take shape in the late 7th century, particularly with the victory at the Battle of Nechtansmere, when the Pictish king Brythé defeated the Northumbrians and established this powerful over-kingdom of Fortrue. And it's scholars like Fraser and Wolfe who've really kind of led this development and idea that the Pictish identity and complexity was a relatively late development. And this contrasts to previous scholarship and early scholarship on the Picts, which really highlighted the big changes happening in the late Roman period. So our first mention of the Picts is in AD 297 or 298 in a speech to Constantius, the emperor, possibly written at Trier. And this is a speech reflecting on the victory of Constantius over usurpers in Gaul and Britain, and is back projecting the Picts to the time of Caesar, and essentially saying that Constantius's victories were much more impressive than Caesar's at this time. And certainly, if we think about what happens across the Roman world, across many of the Roman frontiers, is that we do see some sort of amalgamation of local groups, of polities bordering the Roman Empire, with the view to resisting or indeed engaging with Roman frontier policy. And indeed, if we look at northern Britain, Cassius Dio talking about the 3rd century situation, describing Severus's and Caracalla's campaigns, says this: the names of other British groups have been merged into that of the Caledonii and the Meatai. So suggesting here that there was certainly some sort of political amalgamation of groups in that 3rd century context, which might set the scene for the development of that new term, the Picts, in that late 3rd century context. And certainly once we get into the 4th century, the Picts is the dominant group referred to in the far north. But was this simply a nickname? Was this a lack of knowledge about the north? And indeed, was there not this degree of political consolidation in northern Britain at this time period? So that sets us thinking about, what was the Roman impact on Scotland, and can we connect any social changes? Are there any obvious developments in the archaeological record that might be associated with major social change, social consolidation, and the like? So if you look at the history of Roman intervention in the north, it's one that's quite intermittent, and is changing through time, with a very fluctuating frontier, which is relatively interesting and unusual for the Roman frontier system to shift quite so dramatically. So our first encounters between Romans and the Iron Age population of Scotland was in the 1st century under the Flavian emperors. And the key figure here was Agricola, who was the governor of Britannia. And in the late 70s, he advanced with the Roman army into Scotland, and he reached the River Tay in his first campaign, and according to Tacitus, made firm the line between the Forth and the Clyde, so that the enemy were pushed as if into another island. So here we see a combined land and sea force beginning to start the process of conquest of the region that we now know of as Scotland. And here on the right, you can see a map with all the forts established in that time period, and Agricola himself reaching the Murray Firth in this 1st century context. And this appears to have culminated in this major battle, the Battle of Mons Graupius in the 1st century AD, around about AD 83. And here Tacitus tells us that 30,000 Iron Age individuals met an army of around about 10,000, and about a third of the Iron Age participants were killed in this confrontation. But soon after Agricola was recalled to Rome, many of the northern forts were abandoned. And if we look at the sources for this time period, granted that these are the Roman sources and may not be entirely accurate or certainly not unbiased, we get very kind of little indication of developed leadership or social organization amongst the Iron Age groups in these sources. So leadership seems to be based on prowess in battle, for example, and little indication of permanent rulers in the native groups. After this, in the 2nd century, in the mid-2nd century, we see more limited military campaigns under the Emperor Antonine, and only a few forts north of the Forth were established. But we get this establishment of this new frontier system, the Antonine Wall. So the whole of what is now southern Scotland was once again part of the Roman Empire. But this was a relatively brief phase yet again, although lasting about 20 years in this particular instance. And then the final direct intervention in Scotland by the Romans was in the early 3rd century under Emperor Severus. And here Dio Cassius lists the enemies of Severus as the Caledonii and the Maeatai. And these groups were not abiding by their promises to Rome. So the Caledonii were conspiring with the Maeatai against the Romans. And these are the precursor groups to the Picts who are mentioned in that later 3rd century context. So the governor Lupus was apparently compelled to buy peace for a large sum from the Maeatai. And clearly whatever agreements were put in place were not effective, for Severus himself had to arrive in AD 208. And here, rather than a campaign of conquest, what we seem to have is a punitive campaign, one of genocide, which is the words used in the Roman sources. Large number of Iron Age individuals and communities killed during these campaigns, and really it's a campaign to try and quell this unrest on the frontier rather than a campaign at trying to settle or take over territory. And certainly it seems to be successful in terms of our sources for unrest on the frontier don't appear again for a couple of generations until the later 3rd century. So if we look at the archaeology in the Roman Iron Age, what kind of hints of responses to these attempts at Roman conquest, occupation, these punitive campaigns do we see? Well, in the early centuries AD, we see relatively little change in terms of things settlement. There are a few graves that are intriguing round about the period of Agricola's conquest, where we see Iron Age individuals buried in these quite large kists, buried with weaponry, which is a relatively unusual element of the mortuary assemblage prior to this time period. So it might suggest the emergence of particular individuals who are powerful warriors at this time of conquest or prior to the conquest. And so perhaps some impact on ideology, on leadership, and warriorhood in this early centuries AD context. However, if we look at the Iron Age settlement patterns north of the frontier in the early centuries AD, we see relatively little difference between the centuries BC and the early centuries AD. So the traditional roundhouse structures and settlements endure and continue. We see very few hill forts, but that's a change that seems to happen earlier, prior to the arrival of the Romans, with a lot of hill forts abandoned and very few in occupation. There are a few notable changes in places like lowland Scotland, where we get brocks from the Atlantic West being adopted in these lowland contexts. So some changes, but very much within the Iron Age traditions of architecture. Now, if we look at the later Roman period, from the 3rd centuries onwards, here is when we do see quite dramatic changes in our picture of the archaeology of eastern and northern Scotland, with abandonment in many regions of the roundhouse settlement form, and really a disappearance in many cases of obvious settlement. It becomes very, very hard to find the settlements and settlement sites of these late Iron Age communities. And it's really only in recent years we've been able to trace some of these settlements and see how settlement form was beginning to transform. So some of the University of Aberdeen excavations at Dunacair, for example, showing that rectangular forms of dwelling rather than the roundhouse styles begins to develop in this late Roman time period. So suggesting influence from the Roman world perhaps, and certainly change at these sites. So this leads to a number of questions. You know, what happens to settlements and society in the late Roman period? Is this a period of social collapse following those campaigns by Severus? And is it indeed only in the 7th century that we begin to see more cohesive social frameworks and kingship and kingdoms beginning to emerge? And how does this relate to the origins of the Picts and the development of these new forms of governance in these late and post-Roman time period? Well, one possible answer for where settlement began to focus upon is this late antique hill fort phenomena. So across Europe in the late Roman period, and particularly following the collapse of the Roman Empire, we begin to get the development of this late hill fort phenomena, in which power seems to centralize around these hilltop locations. Settlement seems to revolve around these sites, and they become major power centers in these post-Roman time period. Now, we have examples of hill fort sites, certainly in the early medieval period, and the classic ones that people have gravitated towards, because these are some of the few sites that actually reference in this time period, are these so-called nuclear hill forts, these complex hilltop locations with multiple enclosures and a kind of hierarchical layout. But our archaeology suggests that these are really only developing from the 6th century at the earliest, perhaps more likely the 7th and 8th centuries. So tying in with the idea that in places like Pictland, that these more developed forms of rulership is really quite a late feature in that 7th century and thereabout. Now, there are a few hill forts that did remain in occupation during the Roman period and do seem to have been power centres in the Roman Iron Age and into the early medieval period, into the 5th and 6th centuries AD. But our number of examples is exceptionally small, and the classic and one of the few that people and scholars were able to cite was this site, Treprain Law, which is out with Pictland in East Lothian. And this has really been the classic case study that comprises a major settlement that spans the Roman period into the post-Roman period. And here, early excavations by Curl and Cree in the early 20th century recovered a remarkable sequence of incredibly dense settlement. 182 hearths and structures identified within a very small area of the hill fort excavated in that early 20th century context. and very rich material culture associated with the settlement. Lots of evidence for contact with the Roman Empire, lots of imports of material, and it's been thought that this may well have been some sort of client kingdom or client polity in the Roman period, and it continued into the post-Roman period as a major early medieval power centre. But obviously that doesn't help us an awful lot with looking at Pictland. And really, in this region in eastern Scotland from Fife northwards, hill forts was again largely thought to be a pre-Roman phenomena, and one that was accessible or present from the 6th, 7th centuries onwards. But we've now got a couple of sites that begin to look more and more like the evidence from Trapraean law, and that is what I want to tell you about for the rest of the presentation. So I'm going to start with one site in southern Pictland at East Lomond Hillfort in Fife, and then move on to one of our kind of classic case studies that's been talked about quite a few times due to the focus of a major part of our project at Rhynie from about 2012 onwards. But let's start with East Lomond. So this is East Lomond Hillfort in the Fife, the centre of Fife, and this is the hill fort here, covered in snow, looking down onto the rich agricultural lowlands below. So what is on East Lomond? Well, this on the left here is an image derived from LiDAR, from laser scanning, which shows the complex earthworks on the hilltop at East Lomond. So you can see here all the lumps and bumps, and these describe a complex series of earthworks with an upper citadel, a whole series of lower enclosures, and this very much looks like your classic nuclear hill fort of the early medieval period, so likely to be 6th, 7th, 8th centuries AD in date, and never investigated yet. One of the big discoveries about 10 years ago by Ollie O'Grady and the Falkland Stewardship Trust through a series of projects was the fact that there's also a lower complex of enclosure and settlement at East Lomond, marked in blue here on the diagram. So quite an extensive area, a couple of hectares in extent, around the base of this complex hill fort, and enclosing a series of settlement features. And these were investigated by Dr. Ollie O'Grady and by the Falkland Stewardship Trust from about 2014 to 2019, and really fleshed out the evidence from geophysical survey, which suggested incredibly intensive occupation within this lower annex. And the top left here, you can see some of the evidence with multiple hearths stacked upon one another. So very, very reminiscent of what Curl and Cree found at Trapraean law. So very, very dense settlement. And here there was lots of evidence for metalworking, access to Roman materials, so some unusual Roman imports during the Roman Iron Age, but also post-Roman imports, things like e-ware sherds, which are coming from Western France. So very much like Trapraean, it began to suggest that what we have here at East Lomond is a dense hilltop settlement of the late Roman period, or Roman Iron Age in general, through to at least the 7th centuries AD. And over the last couple of years, we've been partnering with the Falkland Stewardship Trust to follow up all these work and to continue the program of investigation here. We've with local volunteers. We've dug 3 trenches here at East Lomond, and really just backing up what was found in the earlier project. So we've got the annex wall, which we investigated in 2022, marked on the right here in the grey and black, and then a whole series of hearths inside that annex. So this lower fort wall, the annex wall, seemingly defining again this really dense area of settlement. And we began to get some radiocarbon dates for this activity, suggesting 3rd through to the 6th century in chronology. And this is showing some of the very complex sequence of hearths and settlement remains at East Lomond. So again, like Traprain law, multiple hearths, multiple occupations, reoccupations of the hilltop, and some relatively high status artifacts being found alongside these structures. So things like in bottom center here, crucibles for melting precious metals, pottery, Roman imports, and a whole series of other objects found as part of the community excavations here at East Lomond. And then we've been following that up just this summer. We have been doing more work at East Lomond, again looking at this area of the annex settlement, and very much like what we found at Dunacair, it seems like at East Lomond, already in this kind of late Roman period, we're seeing a transition in a type of architecture being constructed here. So you can maybe just make out the outline of a square or a rectangular building here found in the trench, with very substantial hearths, and again multiple hearths built through time. So we seem to see this movement, this shift towards rectangular architecture and very centralized, conglomerated settlement on this hilltop. And again, some nice finds from our 2023 excavations, playing pieces, spindle whorls, and the like. And we're able to get some radiocarbon dates from the settlement sequence here at East Lomond. So beginning to put the chronology on a firmer footing. And what's really, really interesting is that here we have that kind of missing settlement horizon that is so notable in our settlement sequence in northeast Scotland in the late Roman and post-Roman period. So we've got settlement here extending from the 3rd century or thereabouts through to the early 7th century. So really beginning to fill that gap in our settlement horizon, which was missing so obviously. Right, so that's East Lomond. Now let's shift northwards into what became Northern Pictland and look at what in many ways is quite a similar sequence, but with even more detail and fascinating insights into the broader landscape here at Noth. So at Noth, like East Lomond, in the late Roman period, this was located well north of the Roman frontier, which by 3rd, 4th centuries was back down at Tyne Solway at Hadrian's Wall. So these communities are living tens, if not hundreds of kilometers north of the Roman frontier. So this is Noth, another spectacular hilltop site. And this is an image of LiDAR survey. So again, kind of laser scanning from a plane and processed by Dr. James Driscoll at Aberdeen, showing the incredible density of settlement on this hill. So you can see on the top, this kind of oblong feature is an Iron Age hill fort. Lower down, you can maybe just make out towards the edges of the photograph, a lower enclosure, and inside there's all these pockmarks, which are actually houses and structures built on the hillside. And it was in 2019 that we began to investigate this site on a larger scale. So we excavated the lower rampart, which encloses almost 17 hectares. It's the second largest hill fort known in northern Britain. And the rampart has a circumference of about 1.5 kilometers. It's an incredible feat of construction. And our excavations got the first dating evidence from here and began to characterize it, showing that this was a very substantial boundary, about 4 or 5 meters wide, at least 1 meter high, and supporting a big wooden palisade, so a big timber fence essentially, running around the circumference of the hill. And we began to look at the platforms, all those settlements within that lower rampart, and excavated these and showed that every one we've investigated so far is indeed a house or a building of some kind. And on these platforms you can find not just one structure, but evidence for repeated building through time. So refurbishment of houses, one replacing another, houses being extended and modified through time, and an incredible sequence of activity on this hill and on what is not a very attractive place to live today. And on these platforms we find evidence for Roman connections, Roman pottery, metalworking, Iron Age and early medieval pottery traditions, which were almost unknown in this region prior to this work. So again, suggesting quite dense settlement on this hill. And really, we've continued to expand on that. So we've been working every year since 2019, uncovering more of these settlements on the platforms on the hill. So this was our most recent work in 2022, showing these again incredible sequences of hearths built one atop of another, suggesting again really dense occupation on the hill. And this is some of the color-coated Nene Valley ware, Roman material we've found on some of the platforms. And this is our tentative reconstruction of the hill at its height, when it was hosting hundreds of these houses built on the hill slopes. And most importantly has been the dating from Noth, which, like East Lomond, has began to fill in that settlement gap from the 3rd century through to the early 7th century. And this was a real surprise, really. These major hilltop settlements of this kind, like Noth, were often assumed to be early prehistoric, perhaps even Bronze Age in date, rather than being late Roman through to the early medieval period. And what we've been finding at Noth begins to put in context what's located down in the lowlands down below Noth. So in this image here, in the center is Noth, and in the foreground is the Crossdane complex with this Pictish symbol stone in the foreground. And this is located just next to the village of Rhynie, and that village has a really interesting place name, which means a place associated with a great king. And that place name seems to be localized to where we've been doing our excavations over 6 seasons from 2011 onwards. And we were focusing our effort on a series of crop marks that were around the Crossdane symbol stone. And here we found, again, a really densely occupied site, but of a very different character to some of the relatively modest houses and structures on Noth. Here we had an enclosed settlement that was enclosed by ramparts and ditches, and laterally by a really complex wooden enclosure that enclosed a series of large timber buildings inside. And this is a fine spot of not only the crossdane, which still stands there today, the symbol stone with the fish and the Pictish beast on it, but also the famous Rhynie man who came from this area when he was found by ploughing in the late 1970s. And so here on the left is a reconstruction of what we think the site would have looked like, with these complex timber buildings, this very impressive timber enclosure around the site in its late manifestation. And our excavations near the village have also shown that there was a contemporary cemetery associated with this site. And this is where some of the other standing stones with carvings on them have came from, with symbols and a warrior carved on one example. And these were found in association with burial monuments of the Pictish period. And now, in terms of the finds assemblage from Rhynie, we're in no doubt that we're dealing with the very top of the tree in terms of the elites within Pictish society. So here at Rhynie, people are drinking Mediterranean wine in glasses coming from Western France. And this was also a huge production center for high status metalwork of the Pictish period. So we've got the tools for making these objects, and we've got the molds themselves for making things like brooches and hand pins, the kind of elite dress accessories that people would have been wearing in elite society in the Pictish period. And so what we seem to have here is indeed some sort of early elite focus, perhaps even a royal centre of the Picts. And here we've got some of the iconography that seems to go hand in hand with the development of these new forms of leadership and rulership. So we've got the Rhynie man and this axe that's been argued to be a ceremonial axe associated with pagan leadership and cult. And we've also got some objects that might well be cult objects themselves, things like these little decorated axe pins and a little plaque with a face incised onto it. And we also have indications of the kind of warrior ethos that seem to underpin some of these early medieval kingdoms and kings. So we've got production of weaponry on site at Rhynie, and we've also got the iconography of one of the stones, which shows a very unusual depiction of a warrior, only one of 3 or 4 of these warrior carvings from eastern Scotland. And then the really exciting thing about the dating of Rhynie is just how early. And so not quite as early as Noth, but we've got dates from the 4th century at the Crossdane complex. And again, it goes through to around about the 6th century in this instance. So what we seem to have in this landscape is not just one significant site, but a whole series of major sites. And that also extends to another site, which is just located to the south of Rhynie, overlooking the village, where at Cairnmore we found this bivalent fort, where we've got incredible investment in the defences here, with timber revetted ramparts, large timber buildings inside. And so we've gone from a landscape that only had the symbol stones to one that's absolutely jam-packed full of settlement evidence here at Rhynie. And so we seem to have this complex landscape with this multiple sites in operation in the same time period, from the late Roman period through to the 6th or 7th centuries AD. And what seems to be the basis for this is the major hilltop site at Noth. So our earliest dates from this landscape are from Noth itself, where we seem to get the development of this large-scale hill fort settlement. Is it a year-round settlement, or is it a place of seasonal assembly, or a combination of those two? And the development of that site seems to provide the foundations for the creation of this elite complex at the Crossdane from the late 4th century onwards. So, what can we tell from this? Well, I think going back to what we were talking about earlier on in terms of, when do some of these big changes in society happen? Is it linked to the 7th century, or what's the precursor to that? Are the changes in the 3rd century with the changes in how the Romans are referring to society in northern Britain? Is that significant? Well, I think what we can certainly say is that these major hilltop sites, like Tapanoth, are indeed beginning to develop in the 3rd century AD context. So the beauty of radiocarbon dating these days is that when we have multiple determinations, we can begin to model those and begin to get down to the kind of generational level or even decadal level in terms of our accuracy. So this is the start date for the complex at Tapanoth. And you can see that it's likely to have began developing sometime in the third century, and perhaps more accurately, around about 270 to 320 AD. And that's a very intriguing overlap with that first reference to the Picts in AD 297. So it's certainly suggesting that the archaeology and our Roman sources, which are suggesting changes, major changes in Iron Age society, is going hand in hand, and the 3rd century AD is a time period in which these big changes are beginning to happen in society. Now, we've got much fewer dates for East Lomond so far, and our work down in what became Southern Pictland is only really beginning to take off. But already from the dates we've got from East Lomond so far, we've got a very, very intriguing juxtaposition and similarity with the start of the complex at East Lomond with that Tapanoth. So the start dates again suggesting late 2nd, but more likely 3rd century AD for the time in which this major hilltop settlement began to develop and become a major centre of power. So how can we conclude this? Well, I think we can certainly see that we are witnessing major changes in society happening from the 2nd, 3rd century AD context. And this is happening when we get those major references to the punitive campaigns of Severus, trouble at frontier with having to buy off the natives with gifts or bribes, and also happening when that change in terminology happens in the 3rd century with the move to describing the groups as the Picts from the late 3rd century onwards. So these changes happening at the same time as the literary sources are suggesting major developments on the northern frontier. That aside, we can also see that I think our understandings of the scale and scope of late Roman and 5th, 6th century societies perhaps been drastically underestimated. We have estimated that there's something like 800 house platforms on the hill at Tapanoth within the 17-hectare enclosure. That's the scale of settlement that you really don't see until the high medieval period in Scotland traditionally. So it's suggesting again that the kind of complexity, the scale, the number of people gathering or settling in these landscapes is much larger than we had estimated. What it's also highlighting is just how little we knew before and how much we need to continue some of these larger scale archaeology projects to find out more. So on that note, some shameless advertising and reference to money. a lot of our projects have really started off very small scale and have often been helped by people who are graduates from the university or people who have decided to help us out. So we have a fundraising page, and people at Development Trust at the university would be more than happy to talk to you if you ever thought about supporting some of the work at Aberdeen. And also a final bit of shameless advertising is that we have this new book out, The Picts, The Scourge of Rome, Rulers of the North, which is published by Berlin, available in all good bookshops and online. So please buy a copy if you can. And that is me, very happy to answer any questions you might have now.
That was wonderful, Gordon. I really, really enjoyed that. It's been for everyone online. I studied archaeology with him, so this is a really wonderful thing to be able to participate now. But yeah, that was an excellent talk. I have a selfish question before I start reading out the questions that have started in the chat box. Are there any new excavations or any returning excavations to Rhynie? I was at the one in 2018, so I'm just wondering how often you guys are going back there and looking at that specific excavation.
Largely our work in Rhynie is finished. We're trying to, we are writing up the excavations which were funded by Historic Environment Scotland. And we've done a little bit more work on Tap and Noth, but again, we're trying to curtail our excitement to try and get our phase written up. But really, there's a lifetime of work, or many lifetimes of work, at places like Rhynie and Tap and Noth. If you think about, I think we maybe excavated about a dozen or so houses on Tap and Noth, and we've mapped 800. So although we've done quite a large scale project by the standards of research excavations in Britain and Ireland, we're still really kind of scratching the surface in terms of what's out there. So watch the space. We're doing lots of projects across Scotland, but we're extending into new areas like Fife and Perthshire. And also one of our big projects is up at Burghead in Moray, which is looking at a later hill fort of the kind of 7th to Viking Age time period.
Very cool. Very cool to hear all what's happening. There's a comment before I get into the questions from Celia, I think is how that I pronounce her name, saying that there's a new project at Tarbat Discovery Center called The Story of Skins, dealing with Pictish monastery and the books that were made there and how they were made, which is quite cool. Ian asks, could an axe carried by Rhynie man be at least in part influenced by the Roman faces used as symbol of power and authority as magistrates and / executive authority?
Hi Ian. Yeah, possibly. Yeah, I've also been looking at the types of ceremonial acts that the Roman military used as well, which were called dolabras, and they were for ceremonial occasions. So I think there's definitely a potential there for influence on types of practices that some of these early Pictish rulers and elsewhere. I mean, the axe that the Rhynie man carries is very similar to the axe hammer that was found in the Sutton Hoo ship burial, an actual object in that case. So it does look like it's part of a wider tradition of using these axes as symbols of power. But how they were specifically used is probably difficult to say, really.
That's great. There's quite a few comments coming in saying that they're loving your book or they're getting through it and they're reading it at the moment. So that's good to see. There's another question that you briefly touched on with mine, and they're just asking about what are the next activities, archaeological works. So I guess like what's the most impending work that you guys have going on?
We're very active as a department in terms of fieldwork. So lots of projects really. As I say, one of our biggest ones at the moment is at Burghead, where we're again funded by Historic Environment Scotland, looking at a site that's under threat from coastal erosion. And prior to Noth, it was the largest Pictish fort known, and it's spectacular what we're finding there as well, in terms of it's a very well preserved settlement with bone artifacts and some very unusual finds, Anglo-Saxon coins, um, early medieval handbell, lots of buildings and structures there. So again, it's just surprising what's out there. And you know, although we're still quite far behind the archaeology of England or Ireland in terms of their early medieval archaeology, you know, hopefully we can begin to continue making big strides in our knowledge about Picts and the Pictish society. So watch this space. We have a Facebook page and a Twitter page called Northern Picts, and you can follow our progress on social media. We always post about our latest excavations and finds. So we've got a lot of followers on there. So thanks to everyone who is following those pages already.
Yeah, I remember people always asking me, I'm sure you've excavated plenty. There can't be anything else. And yeah, there was always plenty. Someone else is asking, could you elaborate on the Roman imports at East Lomond?
Yeah, so this includes actual Roman material from the third, fourth centuries in particular. So a bit like Traprain, clearly some sort of links here with the Roman military, whether they're receiving material bribes and gifts in order to keep the peace, or whether they are raiding the Roman Empire and bringing some of this material back is difficult to know for sure. And it's very similar to what we're finding at Tappenor. So we've got actual Roman material at Tappenor there as well, which again was a real surprise because there was very few Roman finds, particularly of the later Roman period, in the whole of Aberdeenshire and so again beginning to fill the map in terms of these connections to the Roman Empire. At East Lomond, there's also a couple of sherds of what's called eware, which is pottery coming from Western France. And it's probably for holding foodstuffs, dyes, all sorts of things that have been imported. And that material is generally only found on the highest status sites, usually early royal centres in places like Ireland and Western England, where we have better documentary evidence or excavated evidence. So these kind of imports are real indicators of high status centres and kind of centralisation of power at these hilltop locations.
That's great. There's two Rhynie questions. One is asking about what kind of local pottery did you find there, and then the other is asking why Rhynie, why it was left, why the occupation ended.
Yeah, yeah. Again, it's been really surprising because I think there was very little evidence of any sort of native indigenous pottery tradition in the late Iron Age or into the Pictish period in places like Aberdeenshire prior to our excavations. But we began to find locally handmade vessels at Rhynie in the early years of excavation there. We also found locally made pottery at Dunacair. And now we've got lots of examples from Noth now as well. So we're beginning to recognize this kind of late pottery tradition. And again, beginning to illuminate how people were living, what foodstuffs they were eating, how they were consuming that. Done some early kind of phytolith work through Sheila Prado's work, who's from Canada. She did a PhD in my master's, showing that a lot of these vessels were for storing or consuming barley, so they were eating some sort of porridge, perhaps, in these vessels. So again, it's just these little fascinating insights into Pictish ways that we no idea before our work on these kind of sites. In terms of the end of Rhynie, well, it's it clearly doesn't end in terms of some sort of catastrophic end, because we have pollen evidence from a bog or a mire next to the site, and that shows pretty much unbroken activity right through the first millennium AD. So there's clearly some sort of settlement there continuing, but it does look like the kind of elite focus moves elsewhere. Uh, Tapnov seems to continue maybe a generation or two at most beyond the kind of dating of Rhynie, and Cairmore too. So again, there's some sort of elite focus continuing beyond Rhynie. But we suspect that the main royal centre, or one of the royal centres, seems to shift from Rhynie to elsewhere. Now, it could be Burghead, it could be Mertappa or Benahee, and again, it's only through kind of more work that we might be able to piece together those shifts and changing patterns.
That's great, thank you. Someone is asking about, they said, is there a possible expansion on the comment that weapons were not normally found at burial sites until the Alloa, is that how you say it, burial? Alloa, Alawa?
Yeah, yeah. All right, yeah, so the earlier part of the period. Yeah, in general, weapons are not particularly common in any prehistoric burial context in Scotland, certainly not in the Iron Age, where we have very few burials. So these kind of warrior burials, places places like Alloa, are really quite intriguing because they seem like fairly heavily armed individuals compared to what we know from previously being buried round about the kind of first conquest by Agricola. So it does seem quite a specific response to this Roman expansion or preceding Roman expansion, perhaps with a growing sense of warriorhood amongst these local groups who are seeing these broad changes in Iron Age society across Britain. So, but there's very few individuals so far. But we also have that iconography of the warrior emerging through things like the Plessy warrior, the Rhynie warrior carving. And those are difficult to date because they're just carvings in stone. But the types of spears they carry, the doorknob spear butts, they're called. It's a crazy name. Um, they are of a type where we've now got dates from Ireland and one or two dates from Scotland, which suggest again they're kind of third, fourth, fifth century, around about that time period. So again, they look like fairly early manifestations of the idea of the warrior and the warrior as a leader, perhaps. And if we look at the early medieval sources, there's no doubt that these kings were leaders partly due to their military prowess, and this is how they expand their territories and the like. So I think with an empire on your doorway, it's often what happens. People have to find new ways to resist if that's what they want to do. And you can see a growing kind of warrior ethos in these frontier societies through Roman contact.
Wonderful, thank you. We've got one question asking about how these densely occupied sites, how did they get water to them? And then someone else is asking about if you could expand on lifestyle, diet, sources of food, cooking and storage. You already touched a little bit on the pottery, having different types of grains.
Yeah. I mean, it's very hard to get your head around, isn't it? I don't know if anyone who has visited Tappanop today. It's a very windy, exposed location. Would you really want to be living here year round? So it's possible that rather than a permanent settlement, it is a place of assembly. Where people are coming at certain times of the year for particular harvest festivals to give tribute to the king, perhaps. But having said that, it's much more substantial than any other assembly site that we know from elsewhere in Britain and Ireland this time. You're building a rampart that's 1.5 kilometers in circumference. The number of house platforms, the effort they're going to build these. It could well be that we are dealing with a permanent, or at least a part of that population living there around. And in terms of what are they eating and drinking, well, there's lots of water sources on the hill that they could have used. The pottery that we've got suggests storage and of agricultural resources in terms of arable resources. And some of the animal teeth that we've recovered from Tapanoth show that they were feeding the horses on bark. So perhaps evidence of kind of overwintering of animals there. So yeah, I think it's really all to play for in terms of what this site was, how was it resourced, was it a year-round settlement, and these are all the ideas that we are playing with as we're trying to write up the site and the final monograph. East Lomond is not nearly so large as what we can see on the ground, but still a very substantial settlement, a couple of hectares in extent. A bit more low-lying, but this is what's happening right across Europe, as you get the development of these hilltop locations, and they're partly there for strategic reasons in terms of these are easily defensible locations, and you've got a breakdown of that kind of broader Roman world. So this is what happens in terms of smaller scale solutions and leadership emerging. So it's really fascinating, and to compare to European traditions is going to be interesting as we go ahead. Was that answering all the question? I can't remember. Hopefully.
I think you've answered it. All to do with food and water sources, and the seasonality of them living there. Has there been any research on these social structures at the settlement, and has there been any evidence of musical instruments found as well?
Sorry, what was the first part of the question?
So the first question is asking about, what have you guys discovered about the social structures at the settlements, hierarchical family structures, and then the other question was asking about, pastime. Has there been any musical instruments or anything like that found to keep, entertainment?
Nothing specifically in our excavations, but we certainly know from written sources and finds from elsewhere in Pictland that they did have musical instruments. You can see them depicted on Pictish stones, for example, things like harps and other musical instruments. So clearly, they had kind of developed cultural life, as well as the kind of everyday elements of society that we tend to find more commonly as through the archaeology. In terms of the hierarchy of settlements, you can certainly see that in terms of the material culture coming into different sites. So most of the import ware in terms of the late Roman stuff or the post-Roman stuff is being found at the Crossdane complex, but we do have sherds of Mediterranean wine amphora of the 5th, 6th century found on Tapanoth itself, right near the top of the hill fort there. So people were drinking Mediterranean wine there in the 5th, 6th century, about 550 meters above sea level. So it's amazing to begin to piece together these patterns and how material culture can tell us about the kind of social hierarchies and realities of this time period.
Thank you. So we've got about 5 questions left and about 6 minutes.
Yep.
So I'm hoping maybe we could try to do rapid fire to hopefully get through everyone's questions if you're down for that.
Yeah.
So one question is asking about climate change. Has that been a role in the end of occupation at Tapanoth?
It's certainly could be, but I don't think we've got any indications of major climatic changes in that first millennium AD context. It could have other big changes could have an effect. Things like the Justinian plague in the 6th century could have had some sort of impact on even places this far north. But as far as we can see, it seems like a fairly planned abandonment of the site at the Crosstane complex. It looks like they've filled in all the foundations of the buildings, and there's some examples of deliberate deposition within things like post holes. So it looks like more like it's a shift to another landscape that maybe had more accessibility to a wider population, perhaps, as these kingdoms are growing and expanding through time. So again, these are the kind of patterns and questions we can begin to address, I think.
Thank you. So there's another question saying centralized governance of the Highlands and Islands has been problematic up until modern times, but the Pictish kingdom is presumed to have extended across the whole of North and West. Is it possible to say anything yet about the relationship between the far north, the west, and the Pictish heartlands around the Tay and Moray Firth?
Yes, wow, that's a big question. Yes. Certainly, in terms of what we have from the written sources and the archaeology, certainly suggests that places like Orkney and Shetland were part of the Pictish kingdoms, and we see lots of broad similarities in the material culture, the iconography, the use of symbols in places like Orkney and Shetland and Caithness and the Firthlands, which certainly suggests that those were major parts of the Pictish kingdoms. It's a bit less certain when we go west, places like the Western Isles. We have even less understanding in historical documents for that area, and less indication of things like the use of the Pictish symbol traditions. So it may well be that regions like the Western Highlands and the Western Isles might have been much less part of the Pictish kingdoms and much less part of the kind of centralized political structures of mainland Pictland.
Wonderful, thank you. We've got two questions relating to metal. One is asking about the metal object that was found in Berghead roughly a year ago at the probable site of the chief's house, something in the shape of a spearhead. And then someone else is asking about handpin molds at Rhynie and their use of silver.
Yeah, first question is from Casper. Hi, Casper. We don't know a huge amount about that yet. We're still undertaking conservation down at AOC Archaeology on some of the finds there. But hopefully we should get those back in the coming months, so hopefully we'll be able to say more. At Rhynie, we've got use of silver from the throughout the history of the Crosstane complex there. So all the handpin molds and all the molds I showed on screen very briefly seem to come from that main phase of settlement at Rhynie. So this is Sue Young's asking the question. Hi, Sue. Yeah, the handpin molds seem to come from 3rd, 4th, 5th century contexts. Certainly 5th and 6th century at the latest for some of the handpin molds there. So again, it's kind of shifting our chronologies that bit earlier in terms of some of these major artifact types. So there'll be more in the monograph about this and the use of silver as well. Looks like they're actually refining silver in some of the vessels at Rhynie. So again, this might be part of this power and significance of this site, is that they're actually very adept metal workers, and they're refining silver sources and producing silver objects and bronze objects on quite a large scale.
Wonderful, thank you. I think we have time for one more question. Someone is asking about the Rhynie man and if he's ever going to be seen in public at an art gallery.
Would love to. Yeah, he's currently in the foyer of the Aberdeenshire Council building, and anyone can go see him during opening hours there. It would be nice to get him back more locally, or indeed as part of some sort of touring exhibition. We did have various plans surrounding some of these things, but kind of COVID has rather got in the way. But it'd be nice to resurrect some of those plans and trying to get Rhynie man even better known than they are already. So yeah.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. And I hope that throughout the questions, other people with similar questions, they've been answered. But thank you so much for coming and sharing this to everyone interested in archaeology and the alumni and friends of the university. It's been really, really wonderful. I've absolutely enjoyed it. And everyone else is pouring in their comments of how much they've enjoyed it.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for listening.
So that is it. Thank you everyone for joining. You guys are able to log off now, and we will hopefully see you for another event. And thanks again, Gordon.
Thanks everyone. Bye.